money is smart after the deal is done, right? So it's like, otherwise it's just a check that comes in the door. So it's really about what those investors bring to the table after things are done.
After years of lagging behind, Pakistan's tech ecosystem is coming to life with true gusto. In 2021, Pakistani startups are on track to raise more money than the previous 5 years combined, at over 270 million, and are increasingly gaining interest from name-brand international investors. For insiders, the rapid emergence of Pakistan's startup scene has been no accident, with a growing young population and increasing digital literacy. But where are we really, and is the business case robust enough? Welcome to the Billion Dollar Moves Breakdown, where we unpack some of the hottest trends of the moment in startup and venture land, busting some myths with the brains and analysts behind the deals so you can keep making billion-dollar moves. Today in the hot seat, Misbah Naqvi and Kalsoom Lakhani from i2i Ventures, an early-stage venture firm investing in the best founders solving the toughest problems in Pakistan, with investments like Oraan, Abi, and Taza. These two have been watching the Pakistani startup rise for the last decade. You don't want to miss it.
Talk to us a little bit about, what's happening in Pakistan. What is the business case? Not that we need any more stats, but, to really frame what's happened in the last 10 years. I mean, both of you have spoken about how this is a nascent ecosystem, but what's really moved the dial in really getting funding to where it is today?
So as you mentioned, Sarah, in your introduction, startups in Pakistan over the last, since 2015 to present, have raised close to $500 million in funding. But just this year alone, they've done about $240 million in funding. So basically half of that amount since 2015 to 21 has happened just in this year, and we're not even done with the year yet. So I think that to me is what's really fascinating and also really exciting, because it speaks to just the general acceleration of what's been happening in the funding space. But I think if we were to zoom out about why Pakistan and why now, there's a few different factors that really play into it. So the very first thing that I would say is when we look at the macro indicators, right? I think everyone loves to talk about the overall macro stats. So I don't want to, talk about it too much, but I think it is important to know for people that don't know the market that well, is that Pakistan is the 5th largest country in the world. Our addressable market is getting larger right now. We have about, from an addressable market perspective, 100 million broadband subscribers. We have a very young population. Our median age is about 22 years old. We're going to have the 3rd largest middle class by 2025 after India and China. And so when we take all these stats together, it becomes actually quite an interesting market from that way. I think there was a lot of barriers to digitization before, and that started to shift with COVID in a lot of ways, in terms of the pandemic, obviously being such a tragedy globally, as well as in Pakistan, also pushed a lot of people online, as we've seen in other markets. Whereas, there wasn't a lot of incentive for people to do that before. Now we're seeing people a lot more comfortable being digital, as well as the fact that the regulatory environment in Pakistan really formed a very big ceiling in the space before, in terms of creating a lot of barriers for not only entry, but also growth for a lot of companies. And a few things that changed in the last year alone has been game changers for the space. So as an example, both the State Bank of Pakistan and the Securities and Exchange Commission created a lot of changes. And one of them, as an example, is that founders in Pakistan who are tax residents can now set up holding companies abroad, which makes it, and be able to set up a holding company, which means that foreign capital doesn't have to go directly in the country. And I think a lot of things that Misbah and I get as, questions from foreign investors is, how do we get our money in and out of Pakistan? Like, how do we deal with that potential risk? And there's just this huge potential perception of risk that exists with that. So the fact that they can put their money into a holding company in like Singapore or the UAE or Delaware, in a lot of ways started to just ease things and make things a lot better. From another perspective, the talent started to get better. I think we've seen founders just marginally get more sophisticated, just addressing, as things are opening up, just starting to build companies that are addressing very large market opportunities. We're seeing a lot of Pakistanis come back home from, there was this whole thing about the green mafia that you've talked about before on your show. So there's so much, going on all at the same time, that are all these different levers in place that really allowed for the market to start to shift. We used to see most of the deals that happen only at pre-seed and seed stage. And now we're obviously seeing Series A, Series B deals. We'll talk about the fact that, there's, what happens in the near future, but we're starting to see that value chain start to take place, similar to what happened in emerging markets like Indonesia. We're kind of in the early days of that right now.
Yeah, and Misbah, for you, what have you seen from a funding landscape? I mean, in terms of new names that are coming in, we're seeing a lot of excitement, of course, with big deals, right? From Airlift, even having the leader of your country tweet about them. Are we seeing more foreign players get more comfortable with the thought of Pakistan?
We definitely are, Sarah. I think what we've started to see is that, people are waking up to the opportunity. I think there definitely have been a few big headline deals that have happened in the last, this year alone. That have contributed to a lot of that building of the brand Pakistan. But like Kalsoom said, it's not just the deals alone. It's also the kind of positive work that the government has been doing. And it's also the kind of level of opportunity that we're seeing in terms of the founders and what they represent. But what the big headlines have helped do is make people feel that Pakistan is really an opportunity to tap now. So while we talked about it being relatively early in the ecosystem development, it is still early. It's still an undervalued market in terms of the opportunity that the market represents. But we are seeing things move very quickly. We're starting to see valuations go higher. We're starting to see a lot of foreign funders looking at Pakistan and in some cases, to be honest, driving those valuations higher because they may be
Right.
comparing them to other markets which are either more mature or where they've been used to writing big checks in, for example, in Silicon Valley. So I think for us, it's really exciting to have like serious players start looking at Pakistan as a really important opportunity. It validates what we already know on the ground that we've already been working at, which is that there is a development that's happening in this space, and there's like a sort of a sea change that's happened the last 3 years, I want to say, in terms of where the market is. And then going from there, interestingly, I think some of these things build in tandem, right? So if you look at the kinds of spaces that are interesting right now, there's e-commerce, there's logistics, there's fintech, and these are a trio of things that often go together. And so the development and growth of one is helping push the other sectors forward as well. And we're starting to see more of that interest being picked up by international investors as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to get a sense as well. I mean, we talked about this a little bit briefly, with sort of the airlifts of the world, Bazaar, Series B, Series A, and we're seeing actually quite a lot of pre-seed pushing into seed. How does the funding landscape from a perspective of where are the companies, do we know if the majority, are these sort of outlier cases of the Series B, Series A? And are they taking up a lot of the air in the room, or are we actually seeing the movement across the stages?
I mean, if we want to talk about both Airlift and Bazaar, right? Just those two deals alone were like 110 million, right? Because it was
Right.
85
That's
by
half.
Airlift and
Mhm.
30 million by Bazaar, right? So they did, to your point, they did take up quote unquote the air in the room in that way in terms of the total amount raised. But if we're seeing like quantum of deals, I actually think you're still seeing the most amount of deals happen at pre-seed and seed stage. We're seeing more and more happen at Series A. And I think what's interesting is that, Bazaar and Airlift both represent e-commerce, right? One on the B2B side, one on the B2C
Right.
side. So a lot of those deals have had time to mature. So beyond Bazaar, there's Thajer, which raised Kleiner Perkins, put money into their round, which was $17 million, right? Then we have Retailer that's raising right now. We have, Dastagir, we have Jugnu. So there's a number of players that raised, 6 to 9 months ago, they all raised their seed rounds, and all of them now are closing or have announced their Series A round. So in the e-commerce space, what's really interesting is you're just seeing like a higher amount in terms of the deals themselves, because that space has had time to mature. But in in fintech, as an example, that sector, especially because of regulatory changes that have happened in the last year, that space is just now taken off, right? And to Misbah's point, there's room for those fintech plays right now because of what's been happening in e-commerce. So there's a lot of like really interesting push and pull that's going on. But most of those deals, if I was to compare the quantum of deals in e-commerce to fintech, there's actually probably more fintech deals. Not probably, there are more fintech deals happening than e-commerce deals, but the size of the e-commerce rounds are larger right now just because of where that sector sits in the value chain of funding, right? So we're getting more A and B rounds. And in fintech, we're just now getting into the A rounds on average right now, where most of them have still been pre-seed and seed. So I think those are obviously the two most active sectors. When we look at other emerging markets, those are the sectors that typically take off first as well. And so that's the reason why I think you're seeing more happen in e-commerce and the most amount happening in that space. But then we're starting to see fintech really start to catch up with that too.
Yeah, and I do want to sort of dive a little bit deeper before we go into the sectors. You're really setting us up for that, which is great. But talk to us about, from an investor standpoint, right? We have a lot of funders that are tuning in here. They're excited to hear who are the latest unicorns, what are the latest markets. Are the valuations sort of justified? Are we seeing fundamentals from a business standpoint? Comparing, I guess, from landscape to landscape, Pakistan to, I don't know, Indonesia, even that's not really a great benchmark, but it's sort of following suit with the rise of MSMEs and things like that. Are you seeing sort of the numbers make sense here?
So I'm going to give a mixed answer to that, Sarah, because I think on one hand, what Kalsoom already identified and highlighted as a market opportunity, that's definitely a valid opportunity. There's this big market that's growing. There's a young population. There's access to technology. All of that is true and real and represents a real opportunity. I think the question is that I think a lot of times people from the outside looking in, do look at this opportunity, but what they also should be looking at, and some of them are, is how hard it is to build sometimes in some of these markets and how high friction they tend to be, frontier markets generally, and Pakistan is no exception there. So I think what we need is a little bit of nuance in there as well, so that there's a little bit more due diligence that is being done on what the founders are claiming, what the market opportunity actually represents, how long will it take to get there. So I think it's this balancing act between, being really positive and opportunistic about what deals are coming through and where this next unicorn potentially is going to come from in Pakistan, and balancing that out by not necessarily buying into a hype and the valuation just for the sake of it. What we're starting to see now is that valuations have taken a really big steep incline recently, but I think a lot of that also is important to say is there are some safe future there's some investments that have been raised on safe rounds, which means these are future valuations that we're talking about, and I think the potential for the market to get there is definitely there. So I also think that in terms of global trends, Pakistan is mimicking some of that. The markets are frothy across the world. There's a lot of money chasing few deals, and that kind of drives up the price. So there is a bit of that's happening. At the same time, I think people are getting excited about the Pakistan opportunity. And I think the third point would be that sometimes foreign investors looking in are not necessarily keeping in mind how long that path could be or how tough that road could be. So that I think for us, that tempers the valuation a little bit when we look at what some of those numbers could potentially look like. But again, not to take away from the market opportunity at all. Kaz, do you want to add something there?
Yeah, it's definitely, I totally agree. It's definitely a huge opportunity, but I think it's kind of, every time I see foreign investors tweet about Pakistan, they always just talk about fifth largest country in the world. I'm like, yeah, but underneath that, there's so much more nuance that you have to pay attention to, right? Of like why, as an example, a certain, certain vertical in fintech might not be taking off as much as we think, right? And so I think that really speaks to, a lot of these foreign investors, outside of maybe a few, are writing opportunistic checks about Pakistan, right? So for them, it's like a small part of a very large fund that they're writing. So for them, the price doesn't really matter that much. For us as like local players, we're going to be there when the dust settles. So for us, it really does matter, like what the price is, does it make sense? And I also think, to speak to, what I hope will happen, but I think should be happening more, is that I think international funds need to have at least one local player in a deal, because as Misbah mentioned, these are such high friction places, similar to, all the people that you interview, Sarah, for your show, existing in other markets. It is difficult to execute in Pakistan, right? And so you need a local player that actually understands the market, understands the barriers, has the networks and the relationships to help those things, transpire and for these founders to execute. And so I think it's important. The price is going up a lot, and some of it is merited and some of it isn't. And so I think there is a lot of noise right now, and a lot of, unfortunately, not the smartest money always on the table, right? So I think it's also up to the founders to make sure that they're choosing the right partners in their journey as they're raising.
Yeah, and that's a great point, for founders that are tuning in. When you think about smart money, especially in a market like Pakistan, what does that look like?
Yeah, it means what happens after the deal is done, right? And so it's, for and different investors bring different things, obviously, but for some of these for Pakistan, and we're going to talk about this more, you know, we haven't really, I mean, we've only just had a Series B with Airlift, and then Bykea the year before. Bykea's Series B was 13 million, right? Versus 85 million by Airlift. Like, we are now seeing the size of rounds increase in ways that we did not know were possible before. But we need to see, more investors that could potentially come in at B, C, D rounds, right? So we can start to see those unicorns happen and potential exits. And so having investors at this stage with you that have either deep pockets themselves or have the access to networks that exist that can help you with your future fundraising and are good signaling for that, I think is super important. I think if you're speaking to some of these international investors, a lot of things that are happening right now, Sarah, in Pakistan is a mimicry, right? So we're seeing investors that may not know Pakistan, but they're investing in the Gojek of Pakistan, Bykea, or hopefully maybe one day we'll say that Gojek was the Bykea of Indonesia or whatever. But, I think we're starting to see that take place where, Bazaar, Retailo, all of these guys have a version of themselves in India with Oraan, right? Or things that are happening elsewhere. And so it's important for them as they're doing that mimicry thing. It's also really important for the portfolio companies to know, if you're getting money from this investor, do I get access to founders that are similar and doing similar things? Does that investor have the depth of knowledge to really help me execute because they've seen something similar in their market? Or what does that look like after the deal is done? And then for your local investors, I mean, we talk about this a lot at i2i Ventures. We do a lot of work with our companies. We're very hands-on with them. We help on hiring. We help with our research team, helping them, our networks, things like that. So what is it that you're asking for, I think is really important. So that money is smart after the deal is done, right? So it's like, otherwise it's just a check that comes in the door. So it's really about what those investors bring to the table after things are done.
Yeah, love that. It's very much like marriage, right? It's it's not just on the wedding
You're getting in
day.
bed with someone. Yeah.
Exactly. It's the years and all that you build beyond that. Love that. And now we've already set up for the next question, which is the three sectors, the trio of amazing industries that you're excited about. It sounds like B2B has quite a lot of funding as a vertical. E-commerce, fintech, it all sort of builds into that. But why are these industries sort of taking the lead here? Is there anything in particular?
Kalsoom referred to this earlier in the talk. COVID has really changed things for a lot of people. It's been really tough, but it's also been it's opened up opportunities for people to leverage technology. I think where we've had like a slow tech adoption, we've seen things get much faster in COVID with something like maybe, for example, online groceries, and people getting much more comfortable with ordering online and being able to sort of access goods and services online. So I think one of those factors has been COVID in terms of the tech proliferation. And the pushing forward of something that was already happening as a natural progression in Pakistan, where more people have access to broadband. The population is young and growing, and so younger people are much more tech savvy, much more comfortable living their life online. So I think that the tech aspect of it is definitely one thing. I think the other thing is some of these things are related, like we were talking about it earlier in terms of regulations around fintech. So while the e-commerce space is growing, that payments aspect of being able to complete the transaction online is now being facilitated, and there are more players that are coming in with options that are being given not only to merchants but also to consumers to be able to do more efficiently. And I always say this, that I think from a fintech perspective, you need both push and pull. I think in Pakistan what we've seen is the push aspect, where the government has created a relatively enabling environment and allowed more fintechs to come in. But on the pull, that's something we're starting to see now. And as customers get comfortable with online payments and start using fintech services, I think there's going to be more of that pull where they will demand efficiency in what they do. They will demand convenience. So we're starting to see the beginning of that as well. And I think logistics and transport and this opportunity to use technology in a creative way and disrupt markets that have been very traditional and have been fragmented up to now is again something that we're starting to see. The other trend that is there is Edtech. I think technology again, COVID made it very clear how important technology is to be able to access something like education services. And we're seeing a lot of Edtech plays coming in. We ourselves have invested in Edcasa, which is a company that's focused on exam prep specifically for certain 9th to 12th grade. And so I think some of those plays are starting to get a little bit more mainstream, and that's really a big opportunity going forward as well.
Interesting. And are we seeing, I mean, to this point, we talk a lot about mimicry, and I think that's mimicry is the best form of flattery for Silicon Valley in many ways, and what else we're seeing in the wall, sort of emerging Asia and all that. Is that real innovation in Pakistan?
The word innovation literally means to make new, right? And so if we were to actually say, mimicry is mimicry, but it's not a complete photocopy. You're still making it new for the environment that we are in, right? And so for me, I think that's really where the key is. Like if you were to just drop the same model, like if you were saying I'm launching Ruang Guru from Indonesia in Pakistan, it wouldn't be the same because the way that consumers, consume edtech or learning is very different, right? And so, I think there's like few and far between in terms of brand new things that we maybe have never seen anywhere else in the world in terms of inventions that are probably even happening at the university level, to be honest, in Pakistan. So we can even speak to like the issue of technology transfers and how difficult it is to get, brand new things out there. But for the most part, I think we are seeing versions of what we're seeing elsewhere, but I do think that they are innovative because they're making it new for the Pakistan market and are really adjusting. And that's, you've interviewed Manib from Bykea. Bykea is a great example of that, right? Of like how Manib actually localized a model that's worked in other markets, but really made it work for Pakistan and for the Pakistani consumer.
And continuing to evolve, right? I think the best founders that we're seeing right now are the ones that take something that's worked somewhere else, apply to the Pakistan market with the context, but then continue to evolve. They don't get stuck in that little box of like what they had actually looked at and got inspiration from. They continue to evolve, like Bykea is doing, and sort of continue to build for the market. And I think that's what we're seeing in some of the most exciting founders is that they're not just copy pasting. They're looking at something that may have happened with a startup in India, which is a little further ahead of us as a market, and they're taking lessons away from that, and they recognize that a particular startup in their space perhaps didn't monetize early enough, and now for them there's an opportunity to look at the market a little differently and monetize so that they don't make the same mistakes as somebody else did. So we are seeing some really smart applications in that way, and I agree with Kalsoom. I think that's really where the innovation is coming in.
Fantastic. Well, now to go into a little bit deeper into some of these nuances, this is really airtime for your portfolio companies or any startups that you want to highlight. But for the analysts in the room, the experts in the room, what are your top 3 picks to look out for?
Well, I think, Sarah, that's like Sophie's choice. Like we can't choose our favorite babies. So what we will talk about are maybe the last 3 companies that we announced. We're excited about all the companies in our portfolio, to be honest. But the last 3 are ones that, I think are speaking to kind of also the current needs of what's happening. The earliest one within the last 3, as in not the latest one, was Creditbook, which we've just mentioned. Creditbook is like Kata Book, like Buku Kas and Buku Oraan in Indonesia, digitizing ledgers, which obviously, as an entry point to other financial products is really exciting. But one thing that I'll say really quickly, if I was to zoom out, and the 3 companies that we're just about to talk about, is that all 3 of those companies, the reason that got us excited, as much as the opportunity is interesting and we've seen it work in other markets, is because of the founders and their ability to execute. And I think with Creditbook, they're just incredible at like thinking through, like putting users really at the center of their design. Some of the findings that they've had, if we look at the numbers, it's great, right? 2 million downloads. They have 600,000 monthly active users. So really exciting growth, which I think is why players and funds like Better Tomorrow, Quiet all came into their last round. But also the fact that from an execution standpoint, they really have kept their users at the center of it and have really thought through, as Misbah was mentioning as well, like not just waiting to think about monetization, but really thinking about it as how to monetize, how to build better economics right now, how to build a good model. So really having some exciting stuff on their horizon. So pay attention to them. And I'll just talk about the second, and I'll let Misbah talk about the third. Most recent deal that was announced was Oraan. And Sarah, the founders behind them. So Oraan is a female-founded fintech, which is also puts women at the center of design for their financial products. And in Pakistan, where 93% of women are financially excluded, to me, that is such a huge opportunity for how do we actually include more than half the population who are mostly excluded and building really strong financial products. And so Oraan really started by digitizing ROSCAs, which are, rotating savings and credits associations, like committees that they're called in Pakistan, which was really focused on kind of like more middle class professional women and really learning from that. So again, very similar to the Creditbook founders, the Oraan founders, Farwa and Halima, who are total rock stars, really have the users at the center of their design. The way that they talk about them is so nuanced and so sophisticated. And really from there now launching other financial products, which makes them really excited about, building like this finance platform that is not just for women, but is women first. And I think that to me is like really exciting and something that we're really excited to back in their most recent round. They just closed $3 million in a seed round. And I'll let you talk about our third one. Yeah, go ahead.
Of course, before we jump to Misbah's choice there, on Oraan, I mean, we talked about this. There were investors who just didn't understand the concept, right? This formula of banking, I just don't get it. What do you say to that? And how would you explain this nuance of truly, I think this is really what's different in Pakistan.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what's interesting is that when we look at digitizing ROSCAs in other markets, because ROSCAs as a concept has been around for centuries, right? I think it actually originated in Japan. And so when we look at people that have tried to digitize ROSCAs in other markets, I think a lot of times these guys face a little bit of an uphill battle because people haven't seen it work elsewhere. And that's because a lot of times people were focusing on women in rural areas that were more lower class, which is still a very important segment, but a very difficult segment to build for, right? And so because they're obviously not as like digitally or financially literate. And I think why Oraan, what was really interesting about what they were building is that they were really focused on kind of like a middle class. Oh, and the other thing that Rosca's, the difficult thing was that a lot of those saving circles were very social in nature, right? And so when you make it digital, it strips the social part away from it. And two things that I thought was really interesting with Oraan is number one, they're focused on a segment that has deeper pockets that are more educated, more literate anyway. So already you're kind of starting with a segment that's a little bit different. And then also one thing that Oraan discovered was that a lot of the women that were opting into these committees, these digital committees, didn't care about the social aspect of it, right? Because for them, it was more important about the end of what they were trying to achieve. And so what was really interesting is that a lot of these women don't have formal bank accounts, but have Oraan accounts, right? And that data becomes really important for other financial products. And then also what was interesting is on average, an Oraan customer or an Oraan user was doing about 3.5 committees at the same time, right? Because they're obviously in different positions in that circle. And so just really interesting in terms of what they were able to achieve and just like tens of thousands of women that are and men who are part of it, but also what they learned as a result of that.
All right. Well, Misbah, on to you. What is your top pick?
Yeah, so I'm gonna go on with the theme that Kalsoom started, which is like going in order of like the companies we've recently invested in and announced. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about Taza, which means fresh in Urdu, and Taza is a B2B agri marketplace play set up by again really strong founders, Abrar and Mohsin, who've come from startups in the past. They've worked with Swivel, they've worked with Kareem, but they also have corporate experience with Nestle and Telenor. And so what they bring to the table is this really interesting perspective of looking to solve the supply chain problem. The fresh produce and agri market in Pakistan is a $60 to $70 billion industry, and it's quite archaic in the way the market works right now. So what we love about Taza and how Abrar and Mohsin are addressing the problem is that they're approaching it from a problem solving around the supply chain perspective. How do they build processes around bringing produce from the farmer to the small retailers in a way that provides best access to quality, best pricing, and as well as the efficiencies that they're building into the system. So, again, while this is a tech play, what we love is that they're not going tech first. They're really understanding what the problems are in the market and how those can be addressed. And then they're starting to build the tech layer on top of that to then solve for them. Everything from like freshness and product sorting to speed to market, time to market, figuring out seasonality, for example, because in fresh fruits and vegetables, that's very important. All of those are things that they're building in. What we love is that they've hit the ground running in just a few months. They're at close to $200,000 ARR. ARR. They're really getting into it, and they're starting to hire really strong team in terms of the background of people that have this mix of tech and agri and product and operations. So I think for us, this is the kind of company, these are the kind of founders that are tackling big problems. And I think going back to the two examples Kalsoom shared as well, and I think this is a theme that runs across our portfolio, all of the founders that we've invested in and the companies we're working with are solving big problems in Pakistan.
Yeah, and I absolutely love that, that point on really playing a big role, right? Because unfortunately, in saturated markets or developed markets, we see a lot of incrementalism, right? Where it's another app for something which doesn't really, change many lives. It might make a lot of money, but in emerging markets, what I'm excited about is just the opportunity of really leapfrogging on one hand, and also really making true change, especially with this wave of digitization. Now, we've talked a lot about good things, and of course, I think as venture capitalists, as investors, you all have to be optimists. We have to be optimists in this day and age to continue to do the work that we do. But what are some of the challenges in the road ahead?
One of the things that is part of a very fast-growing market, Sarah, is access to talent and good people. I think we're starting to see that challenge coming up. I think it's really important for us to focus, and that's why at our end, we really focus on helping our founders with hiring, because as this market grows, as the competition increases for good talent, and the pipeline is not keeping up with it. So I think that's a challenge where we really need to come together as an ecosystem and really foster good talent development, so that a few years down the line, we're not really seeing this bottleneck put a stop to the kind of progress that we're hoping for and expecting to grow into at this point. So I think that's really one. Another one is I think a factor which is to a certain extent beyond our control, which is macroeconomics and the geopolitical situation. I mean, I think it would be an ostrich approach if we were to not address that. Pakistan is a market that is very high potential, but is also in a geopolitical situation and in a macroeconomic situation where there are things that may be unforeseen that come down the road. And I think the third one is potentially not having enough exits on the table right now, which is a question we get asked a lot. And I don't know, Kaz, I'm setting you up for this, but I don't know if you want to maybe talk to it a little bit and then carry on with your points from there.
I mean, it's interesting because the market obviously has shifted so much just in the last 9 months. So I think at the speed that we're going, I think we're going to see companies that at least are valued at like maybe potentially a unicorn status in the next year, right? I think in 2022, we'll definitely see that. I think what's really interesting in Pakistan is that we're all of us who are in the market and have been in the market, we're all building the road in front of us, right? So we're not going to go away if the geopolitical situation changes. Like we're in it for the marathon, not the sprint right now, right? So for those of us, and that's why I think it's really important, every ecosystem, East West is like this in Indonesia, you need to have strong local VC funds that can be there sustainably throughout the ups and downs that happen in any market, but especially in a market like Pakistan that has the potential for that friction. And I think when it comes to exits, I think we're seeing things start to open up, right? So a couple things that are really interesting. I think we're going to start to see, obviously, ideally C, D, E rounds happen. And I think from that standpoint, I think we'll potentially start to see potential for regional acquisitions, regional consolidation. I think as players look outside into Pakistan, it'll become much more of a stronger story or a stronger justification to acquire a local player rather than try to enter the market on their own. And I think that's what we'll start to see as these local players start to gain a lot more traction in the businesses that they're building. I think we're starting to see a lot of entrance into certain segments. So in the B2B e-commerce, a lot of plays in the trucking space as an example. So I think we'll start to see consolidation happen there, which I think is also really strong signaling for that. But I think at the end of the day, because we are kind of building the road in front of us, when it comes to even exits on, in terms of IPOs and things like that, we're starting to see, the Pakistan Stock Exchange as an example start to build out like a gem board specifically for SMEs. We're still ways out from really figuring out what that looks like in practice, but I think those are really strong indicators of how we start to prepare the market, not only for growth stage levels of investment, but also potential for actual exits. Like where do these companies go at a certain point? Where are those liquidation events?
And what a great way to sort of end on a high note as well, and sort of being grounded in reality. But final last words for those who are tuning in, they could be founders or funders that are deep in the rough, thinking about their work, what would you say to them? Maybe start with Misbah and then to Kalsoom.
Yeah, I think for founders, I would say just look around you. Pakistan represents so many opportunities to really build something that has impact in a way that's long term, but also is allowing you to become $1 billion company. And there's a lot of opportunity here, which is why we're really bullish about it. I think I would just say persevere and just stick with it. And there's this sea change that's happening around us, and hopefully that, like we say, rising tide lifts all boats, that this is really the right time to get in and build something.
Thank you. And Kalsoom?
Yeah, I'll just speak to the potential founders as well. So I think it is really exciting right now. It can also feel a little discouraging. So I think that it can feel really intimidating how much people are raising and feeling like, could you ever get that, right? And I think what's really important for founders to keep in mind is that raise when you need to, and don't raise a huge amount just because you feel like that's what people are putting success, like labeling as a success. Raise smart and raise from investors that really understand your journey. The other thing is like really focus on that execution, right? I think a lot of times, like with everything, all the noise that's happening around us, the PR stuff, the awards, all of that, like for us as investors, we really love founders that are just going to roll up their sleeves and execute. And so really focus on that. And that's really what matters at the end of the day. When all the dust is going to settle, the companies that are going to really survive and do well and thrive are the companies that really worked on like what their models were and really focused on the execution and really were very thoughtful about their journey.
Great. Well, ladies, thank you so much for your time. I think we've covered good ground here, and I'm really excited for what you are all building. I've seen the hard work that you've both put into, right? Really rolling up your sleeves. Talk about investors that really roll up their sleeves for founders. I think, both of you have really set the tone here on what leadership looks like, and we are so grateful to have you in the ecosystem and grateful for the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Sarah. We're so grateful for you too, and so grateful for the community that you've built. So we're just really proud to be part of that as well.
This was $1 Billion Breakdown Pakistan with Misbah and Kalsoom from i2i. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Be sure to share, like, and subscribe for more good stuff like this.